Awesome. Okay. So again, like I said, I've never done anything like this before. I haven't really heard of people doing this either. But here's the idea, right? I am signed up to like your Google Scholar page. So whenever you publish an article, I get an email of the new research that comes out. And I saw an article called let me just make sure I get the title right. Um, uh, a personalized approach to identifying important determinants of well-being. And
Yeah.
I dropped my marbles. Like that was amazing. My jaw dropped to the floor. Like I was like, oh, this sounds so cool. I gotta read this, right? And then I saw how many pages there was, and I
Yeah.
thought about, oh, like there's a lot of things I gotta read, and I got a lot of things going on. I don't know. And then what if I like try and read it, come up with my own conclusions, and they're wrong? Um, so this is for past me, right? It's not
Okay.
something to substitute reading the paper itself, but it's something that will get people in the door so they feel a little bit more comfortable being able to read the research themselves or just kind of learn about it and through a different medium. And
Yep.
so yeah, the idea is just kind of to talk about the paper, have
Sure.
fun and get people in the door.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you want to start? Do you want to start with the kind of the introduction and the idea behind the paper?
Sure,
Does that
yeah.
seem like
I
start
mean,
at the
I
beginning?
you can talk about the paper kind of the way that you want. I was thinking that if you didn't really know where you wanted me to start, we could start by just kind of summarizing the abstract and explaining what some of these bigger words mean. But yeah, just in
Yeah,
what
yeah. I'll start with the introduction because I think
yeah.
you'll probably be sharing this with a lot of people who do clinical work or want to help people.
Exactly.
And so we start with um, the past, what has been done in the past. So when we try to figure out how to help people, we in the past have taken whole interventions like acceptance and commitment therapy, and we make it into a standardized package
Yeah.
so that it's as much like a pill as possible. It's the same thing that we give to everybody, right? That
Mhm.
makes sense. It's a sensible thing to do. We give that to a group of people. We give ACT to a group of people, say, and then another group of people get a placebo or some active control, which might be just we give them attention in some way. You know, maybe we
Mm,
have them talk to each other in a group or something like that. Like you want to make the control group as similar as possible.
interesting.
And we then compare, we do the intervention, we compare ACT versus that control. And we hope that the ACT group improves things much more than the control.
Mm,
Um, and so that, and it does, there's been lots of randomized controlled trials showing that ACT improves people's well being. And then we look at the processes that underpin ACT. So we want to know, okay, if it does work, why does it work?
okay.
So the most common mediator we look at it in ACT, at least, ACT well, the psychological flexibility.
Mm,
So when a group of people get ACT, they tend to, on average, improve in terms of the ability to persist at the things they care about and change what they're doing when it's not working, which is psychological flexibility.
mm.
It's a bit more complicated than that, but you know. So from that, we conclude that ACT benefits mental health, and it does so by increasing psychological flexibility. And so
Mm.
that's where we are at today. That's the story. Now, this is not just ACT, but every version of psychotherapy has really focused on this kind of design. Mostly, there are exceptions, but underneath it is this pretty important assumption, and that is that what happens in the group is also true for every individual.
What does that mean?
So if so we say ACT has a, let's say, zero point 0.5 benefit. So zero point 0.5, you don't have to know exactly what that means, but it just means it's about a medium effect. People improve a decent amount
Okay.
in mental health. We assume that that effect applies to each individual at zero point 0.5. So
Mm.
each individual improves a moderate amount. So that assumption is called, you know, you're assuming ergodicity, which means the same thing that causes mental health at the group level causes it for each individual.
So let me make sure I get this right. You're saying is that the assumption with from what I understand, what you're describing is randomized control trials where you have,
Yep.
a depressed group and a control group. Well, I mean, I
Hmm.
bet they're both depressed, right? And you have experimental and
Yeah.
control, and you throw CBT at one and
Yeah.
some
Exactly.
not CBT at the other, or ACT, or whatever it is, right? Um, and you try and measure the differences, right? And if you see that, for example, CBT or ACT works for when you average together the effects for all the people
Yeah.
involved, and you find that 0.5, so a medium effect from
Yeah.
acceptance of therapy or CBT or whatever it is in reducing depression, we think that, okay, if you are a depressed person, then CBT will have a medium effect because it had a medium effect
Exactly.
for the group.
Exactly. And it's a very deeply held assumption. I mean, most people say, yeah, there's variability. Not everybody responds the same. Most people will agree to that, but they act as, but in our publications and the way we train people, we don't act as if that's true. So we will teach people how to do manualized therapy. So people will, so just, I know, Ben, you're still an undergraduate. It's amazing that you're doing these podcasts at this stage in your career. Well done, by the way. Um,
Let's see how it goes.
when you get to graduate school, so you'll learn things, you'll learn to do certain basic things like CBT, and you'll diagnose using the DSM. And I think generally the way we teach is that these things, these skills you learn can be applied to everything and everybody.
Mhm.
But then what typically happens is clinicians get out into the world, and suddenly you're dealing with a 25-year-old who has testicular cancer, and it was completely different from anything else you've ever seen.
Mm,
Or you're trying to help somebody who's like 73 and has lung cancer. I'm just
mm,
using two examples in the cancer area that would be so qualitatively different in terms of experience, in terms of what was driving their depression.
mhm,
And my talking to people who have come out is like they don't feel like they know what to do.
mm,
One of the most common things in psychology is an imposter syndrome, because you feel overwhelmed. You don't feel like you cannot handle all this diverse types of clients. I'm just talking about cancer, but what about somebody with diabetes, or somebody who's just gone through a divorce, or somebody whose son just died,
mm,
you just start to think of the diversity of people's experiences. Somebody who's an alcoholic, somebody who's, just a bit of a perfectionist. You
yeah.
start to think about the diversity of people, and there's no way that one approach is going to fit everybody, is there?
Mm,
There's no way the same thing's going to drive well-being for everybody. I mean, we kind of know that, but we haven't really worked through how we handle it in training,
mm,
and how we teach people to be able to flexibly adjust on the fly, and not necessarily do the same standardized treatment, but rather personalize it. How do we personalize it so that we don't necessarily, like, my favorite thing to do in interventions is often willingness. I will often talk about a
mhm,
willingness hierarchy, like you need to be, like, I encourage people to be bold, and what is the hardest thing you could do to achieve your
mm.
goal, and what's the easiest, and then we do that. I love doing that, right? But what if that's not called for some people? um,
Do you find for
I
some
will,
people that just doesn't work as well for others?
it's not the right thing to be doing at that time. It's not.
Mm,
Sometimes people just need you to sit there and hear them and
first,
not do anything.
yeah.
Sometimes people are right into problem solving mode, and they're ready to go. Um, sometimes so this is the challenge. But let's get back to the paper. So that's the premise. It's called ergodicity,
Okay.
and it just means that we assume the same effects apply to everybody. And so
Can
I've given you an intervention example,
Yeah.
but also a lot of research is done correlationally, where we say, okay, self-compassion correlates with well-being. Therefore, self-compassion is something we should be teaching people, right? And that's probably generally true. But an assumption made about groups. You take a group of people, and people who are high in self-compassion tend to be happier. So we assume that effect at the group level applies to every single individual. And so what this paper is about is trying to look at that, look at each individual effect, and see if the group average actually applies.
Yeah. So you had mentioned ergodicity, and I was wondering if I could just summarize some of the ideas that I've heard. you talk about, just to make sure I understand them. Is that right?
Yep. Yep. Sure.
Okay. Let me just write down really quick some of the things.
I know it's a lot to take in, but the issue is kind of big. And
Yeah.
if you want, I know you want to be a practitioner, Ben, and this is going to be really relevant to you
So I
because
actually am I'm really interested in learning about this stuff, and but I'm not actually interested in going to graduate school or becoming a practitioner or researcher.
okay,
So in terms of
okay,
what I want
cool.
to do to apply this stuff, we'll figure it out. But a lot of this is just
Yeah,
I'm really interested. All right. So
yeah, yeah,
let me, let me
absolutely.
let me make sure I understand. So some of the things that I'll try and read some of this research myself, and I'll hear a lot about ergodicity. So I want to make sure that I understand it. So I
Yeah,
was wondering if I could explain kind of how I understand ergodicity.
definitely, definitely.
So ergodicity looks at a comparison between ensemble averages and time averages. So ensemble averages have to do with like if you have the example that I heard about and the example that I'm pretty sure is how ergodicity was first explored. It was looking at gas molecules, right? And
Yeah,
gas molecules, they'll kind of vibrate around. And the ensemble
yep,
average has to do with the group, right? So if you average all the movements together, right, you'll kind of get this jiggly cloud, which is this gas, right? And you can take an
yep,
average measurement of its energy or whatever it is, right?
yeah,
Movement.
yep,
Or you can take an ensemble average, which is you look at one molecule across time, it'll vibrate, and you have this little measurement,
yeah,
and you see when you average the kind of measurement across time together, and you
yeah,
average the ensemble, so just one snapshot of time for a group, you see if those averages are generally the same, right?
yep.
Um, uh, but yeah, and but it's I don't think it's just that, right? Because it's like,
Those are two types of averages.
yeah,
Yeah. So, um, but in both cases, they're averages of
okay.
multiple molecules. You're not talking about the life of that individual molecule that tends to jiggle left, right, up, down, and then
Mhm.
shoot across the room, bounce.
Yeah,
Like what if each molecule has its, actually using an example, I think that it does satisfy ergodicity is a funny one, but it would be as if each molecule had its own personality. And then by averaging, you are losing sight of that. You're losing sight of how they were different. I actually think that example is one of the cases where ergodicity works, I think.
depending
But
on the
in
gas
most,
molecule, I think, yeah, but
yeah,
it,
but with
yeah,
humans, when you talk about like, what's makes you happy, Ben, you seem already to me very distinct, and I would hate to try to play what's true for average
mm,
Generation Z 23-year-olds to you. I mean, I think that would be a disaster.
yeah,
So that's the idea, like each you and like that's a classic example, Generation Z, making trying to make conclusions about your entire generation and then
yeah,
apply it to you. That's ergodicity. So if is Generation Z, by the way, they say this about every generation. Generation Z is lazy, therefore Ben is lazy.
mm,
That's what we're doing. I mean, we say no, that's not right, but we do it in practice. That's what we do when we say, Generation Z is different in this way.
mm. Interesting. Okay, yeah, um,
So
okay,
it's
and then
about averages versus individuals, really. Like, what is your unique life trajectory?
yeah,
What's unique about you? And it isn't that important?
but I think also this idea about ergodicity that's important, from my understanding, is it has to do with this idea of like a dynamic model that like there's this entity that responds to certain variables, and like the CBT or the pressed group that receives CBT will respond a certain way, which is a very tight decline in average symptoms, right? But for individual people, they might respond very, very differently to different aspects of
Exactly.
treatment. And so that's what this paper is trying to look at is, given the assumption that people are very different, right? It's almost a cliche, I imagine, in clinical work that every patient's going to be different. Everyone's going to need a different thing, right, or respond differently and have different needs.
Yeah,
So it's trying to look at, well, what are those needs and how can we individualize this to make a more
exactly.
powerful impact?
And really the first step we have to take is to show that the processes we thought were good for everybody aren't necessarily good for everybody or don't
Ooh.
work the same way for everybody. Because that really makes, I think this opens the door for some of the things we were talking about before we started this podcast, Ben, where you were talking about how writing a book about how people can be with other people who are struggling with mental health
Mhm.
issues and how maybe they can help. I suspect the book might have a little bit of that.
Yeah, it struggle it's careful with that word help, right? But
Yeah,
um yeah, no, how can we show up in the best way to, you know,
yeah.
yeah,
So
support
you're
and be
talking
able to
about
be
some
helpful.
exactly, and you're talking about somebody who hasn't necessarily gone to grad school and learned the package.
No.
So the way the way training has worked typically is you have to get this specialized training in a package
Hmm.
that's evidence-based to do that. But with a process-based approach, it does you don't have to learn the entire package, and you don't necessarily have to be able to do everything. Like you don't have to be able to do exposure. Like there's certain evidence-based processes you could put into play, not having gone to grad school, that could help your friend.
Hmm.
I know that a major source of help seeking is with hairdressers. Hairdressers, people turn to hairdressers for help, and they provide help.
Mm.
And I think you could train hairdressers to do what they already do pretty well, probably to do it even better without having them to go to, uh, get a certification in a package. And so
Yeah.
that's one of the exciting things I wanted to mention about process-based therapy. I think it democratizes interventions so that the kind of book you're writing is viable because it means, of course, there's things you can do.
Yeah.
Maybe the things that you have to know the limits, maybe exposure and certain kinds of processes are a little dangerous and they should see a clinician for that. But the things like, helping the person to think about what's important to them, helping the person to problem solve,
Yeah, exactly.
being present with that person when they're struggling with an emotion and
Hmm.
accepting it. Like those are processes you can do. Those are processes that teenagers can do.
Hmm.
Like I've actually done work with teenagers and I want them to actually bring the change they want to see
Hmm.
into their own school. Let them be the interveners. So that's kind of one of the coolest implications of process-based therapy, I think, is that when you take processes outside of the trademark packages, outside of the certification programs, you make it more accessible and suddenly more people can do it. You could be doing it right now in some form, knowing the
Absolutely.
limitations, but also knowing the things you could do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think no, I think that that's fascinating. It's one of the kind of frustrations that I ran into when I first was learning and reading a bunch of books on psychology and stuff like that was you know, if I had a friend or a loved one that was going through a rough time, there's barely any resources out there, right? But if you look towards self-help, right, it's not like it's because there's nothing that we can do. If you look towards self-help, at least the stuff that has some evidence or research to support it,
Yeah,
it's all based on clinical psych, right? It's all based on research
yeah,
in
absolutely.
CBT or
It
in
is.
ACT, right?
It
It all
is.
is based on that stuff. And that's
Yep,
research that's looking at applying these processes for other people, right? Um,
absolutely.
so it's
Yeah,
being translated for people to be able to help themselves. But in terms of
yeah,
being able to be present and being supportive and maybe even use or engage some of these processes with other
yeah.
people, um, yeah, I definitely think that
I definitely
the,
think that you can improve people's skills in that without having to go through the big certification process. And certainly the issue of mental health struggle and suffering is so big that we need everybody to be helping each other. We need
you know,
all of
help
us
people
to
get.
kind of understand sometimes the person just wants to be heard. Sometimes we can trigger avoidance processes by the way we react. Think basic principles like that we can teach.
Mm,
I think lots of people
yeah.
can teach, construction workers, hairdressers, doesn't matter, builders. Like it doesn't really, like we need everybody to be pitching in and understanding why suffering is happening and helping each other. So that's why I was excited to hear your book idea, actually. That sounds like a very cool idea.
Yeah. So but let's get back to this paper because I don't
Sure.
know, this sounds fascinating. So yeah,
Well, I'm laying the groundwork because it's not like, because you have to understand the premise that it's working inside. It's like,
absolutely.
is it the case? I mean, everybody admits, okay, that yeah, there's people differ and not everybody responds the same way to therapy, but the way we train and teach is as if you should
Mm,
be doing the same thing for everybody. So we don't in practice translate it, but I think clinicians especially and practitioners especially know everybody's different and they have to customize it. It's just that we academics haven't done a great job of aligning the way we research with that reality.
mm,
So what we did, this paper pulls together three big data sets. One collected by Andrew Glaster, another one collected by Brandon. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting names, and another one collected by Corey. They're three graduate. They were graduate students with
Hmm.
Steve, Brandon, and Corey, and they have done a really good job. So it's Corey Stanton, and just so people know that these are upcoming, people who will be doing this research for a long time. Brandon Sanford and Corey
Mm.
Stanton. So two of the data sets were from them. And Andrew Gloucester was the third one. And they did a really good job of collecting a very specific kind of data set, which was not looking between people, like are people higher in self-compassion, um, happier. That's a between person question, but looking intensively within person. So it would be like following you, Ben, repeatedly for 40 time points.
Yes. I think I've done this before. So it's experience sampling method. I did one where I was asking myself questions about DNAV every hour for I think it was like 13 time points until I got to 90.
Really?
And I did that until I got all 90 measurements so I could put it in a gimme. But by the time I finished, I was so burned out that I didn't actually process the data set. But it was relating the DNAV processes to some like life satisfaction questions that I modified for
Oh,
ESA.
great. Oh,
But
great. Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. Very cool.
So
Yeah,
just
we're hoping to make that
measurements across
process a
time.
little easier. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree that that would be tiring for you to do by yourself. We are working on technology with Steve Hayes um, to kind of make that a little more automatic and
Hmm.
easier, so you don't have to do all the work. Because I agree, it could be quite a heavy lift.
Awesome.
But okay, so what you do is you measure processes. So you know, Andrew Gloucester was very, we focused for his data set on Cyflex, which are like the processes related to the six dimensions of ACT,
Hmm.
like acceptance, contact
Diffusion.
with the present moment. So he's got the six items that really map nicely to that. For Brandon Sanford, we use the process-based assessment tool,
Hmm.
and that just focuses on, um, what people are motivated to do during their daily life, variation, selection, and retention. So
Yeah, different
we,
measures on of the EAM.
yeah, exactly. Of what are they yearning for? Are they doing that? Are the behaviors they're doing that helping them to get what they're yearning for? Are they able to vary what they do? And do they keep doing things that work, or do they have trouble persisting? That's variation, selection, retention.
Yeah.
And finally, Corey Stanton's PhD focused on um, the fiat, so the functional, so basically social behavior and how that impacted life.
Yep.
So they collaborated with me and along with others like Steve Hayes and
Yeah. And
lots of others.
if I can just add, the for ACBS members, the PsychFlex is available for free. I've taken a look at him. It looks pretty cool. I'm not a clinician, but it looks pretty cool. I've used it a couple of
Yeah,
times myself. The PBAT is also available for free.
yep,
And you can just download that. I imagine as well for the Fiat as well.
absolutely, absolutely.
Cool, cool.
But I just wanted to give you a sense of the breadth of and the young people coming up. Um, Corey and Brandon, you'll see a lot
Okay.
more of in the space as we go along. But we just wanted to look at one little piece of their data. Like they have much bigger kind of set of findings in this, but we looked at just what is the relationship of the processes and outcomes. So an outcome might be positive affect or negative affect.
Okay.
For Corey's study, it was loneliness and support, social support. What is the links within person? Are
Mm-hmm.
they the same? Being assertive good for everybody? For
Mm-hmm.
example, is so we what we able to do is within person we can do these measures, and then the correlation we get. Let's say we get a correlation between. Let me pick one. So one of the ones I put in the paper was persisting at something that's worked in the past. So that's a PBAT item. Kind of gets at retention, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just looking. So I'm looking at the. Okay, so I've got three examples. So let's say it's persisting at what's worked in the past, and how does that link in your daily well-being? So in days when you persist at things you know have worked in the past, do you experience higher well-being? On days when you do that less, Do you experience lower well-being?
Mhm.
So the question is this really a driver in your daily life? Yeah, that's the big question. And we looked at a whole bunch of processes that we thought processes are the things that we think are good for people, that if they do those things, if they engage in those things, and we'll talk about those in a sec,
Yeah.
they will be more effective, more successful, happier, have more meaningful lives, the whole thing, you know. So a
Yeah.
process might be accepting feelings, a process might be getting clear on values, a process might be asserting yourself, a process might be um, allowing feelings or thinking in an effective way. Process could be negative too. A process could be ruminating over and over again about something. Process, you know, so doing things to hurt your health might be a process. So it's those a sequence of events that kind of lead to well-being, lead to
Yeah.
some sort of, and so we can
So
measure that within person.
yeah, so from my understanding, there's three data sets. There's one that's a fiat that's looking at like different social skills that are important for social connection, right? And there's
Yep.
this assumption in normative research, these big trials that we found that social connection is important for positive affect, is important for well-being. Another data set is looking at the psych flex, the psychological flexibility. It's using it that measure, and there's this assumption, right, based on a lot of group research that shows that psych flex is good for well-being. So what we're looking at is across individuals. If everybody is different, does that mean that, psych flex doesn't work for some people, or is not as helpful and stuff like that? So you're measuring individual people
Yeah.
across time. And lastly, there's this data set looking at the process based, the PBAT, which is a huge bank of process measures. And you're looking at, how does that affect well-being
Yeah.
for people, for
Exactly
individual
the elements
people?
of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a process in the PBAT might be since the last prompt, I did things to hurt my connections with others.
Mm.
Now you might think, well, this is bad for everybody. Surely this is bad for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the question, is it like, and I'm not saying you should hurt your connection, but we can talk about the implications. But let's talk about the data first.
Sure.
And so it's also a question of how bad is ergodicity violated? How personal are these processes? Is it like true that, oh, there's some variation, but mostly it's, you know, everybody
Mm.
is the same. Okay, so I'll give you the take home. Like I was shocked at how bad it was. Like in terms of like group averages really applying very badly to individuals.
Wow.
It didn't look like we could do that.
So what are some
And
examples?
just okay, so we'll start with just something called autocorrelation. That's the stability
Okay.
of process and stability of emotions. Well, first of all, people differ a lot in how stable the processes are. So for some people, hurting their connection with others, they're very stably doing that all the time. Other
Ah.
people it happens sometimes, sometimes it doesn't. So my first question
Ah.
is that relevant to interventions? Would you, if you're trying to help somebody, would you want to know that this
There's
person
this one.
occasionally does something really bad in a relationship versus this person's consistently doing it all the time?
Yeah.
So that's not even getting to the, that's like just
Sure, sure,
people
sure.
differ in their stability. But if you look at the actual processes, I'll give you some examples. Um, we'll talk with Andrew Andrew's measure, which is the Cyflex.
Yeah.
What you find is something like focusing on important moments, right? So that's like contact with the present moment.
Sure.
That's pretty important, right? That does tend to have the effect you would expect on a good portion of the people. So the Cyflex does have a generally positive effect, but we find that the variation is substantial.
Mm.
And what that means is that for a good, I would say maybe 1 in 5 people,
Okay.
that particular process was not necessarily linked to positive things in their life.
Wow. So let me make sure I understand. So for PsychFlex, while it was very helpful for a good amount of people, for about your guess is about 1/5 of them, it
Yeah,
didn't
there's a
have a
table
significant.
I'm looking. Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
table I'm looking at right now in the paper. If you look at, you don't have to look at it now, but table 3, you'll see that for 16, 17, 18% of the people, the relationship between focusing on the moments and well-being was either zero or the wrong way, the wrong
Negative.
direction.
Yeah, it was negative
Yeah,
for predicting negative affect, so it didn't actually
Yeah.
have much of an effect, or it produced the opposite of what you were looking for.
Yeah. So for about, and I'm picking the process that's most, like one of the ones that's most clearly linked to the group average. Like for a lot of people, it is beneficial.
Mm,
But for some people, and I'm not saying that like at this time in this context for these subset of people, when they focus on the present moment, it's not necessarily positive.
mm,
Um, in their daily life, it's not saying that, and actually, when you start to say, wow, how is that possible? We've assumed that, this is always a good process. But when you start to think about it, we can't think of the process in isolation. Like, what does it mean when when you, let's say you're a particular person, are focusing on what's happening in the present moment? Are you also being very judgmental of what's happening in the present moment?
mm,
Does it have a lot of other things? Is the present moment filled with hardship you're trying to resolve? So it's not necessarily a bad thing that focusing on the present moment brings negative effect,
mm,
because you're trying to solve a problem or deal with a sick loved one or something like that.
mm,
So you start to see like focusing on the present moment doesn't have the same meaning for everybody. Holy cow. And it probably depends on how it links with other processes. Like I said, so another process in the Cyflex is allowing feelings. So let's say I'm just thinking out loud here what it might be, but if you were somebody who focused on the moment, but you didn't allow feelings, you thought some
mm,
certain feelings were terrible, then
mm,
focusing on the moment might not be a positive process.
mm,
So we were able to show, so this is the first data set, Andrews, Cyflex, that even this one did have normative effects. So a lot of people did benefit, but
mm.
we showed very significant and substantial heterogeneity. So much
Ooh.
so, we used meta-analytic techniques. And so there's rules in meta-analysis. Like, so meta-analysis where you take a whole bunch of studies and
Mhm,
you try and average the effect. So you take all the ACT studies and then you say, what's the average benefit that it produces for mental
mhm,
health? But then there's a test of heterogeneity, which is like, if the studies are very different from each other, and
mm.
there's a rule, if the studies are very different from each other, then as a meta-analytic person, you're not supposed to average. It's a bad idea to take the average because it doesn't,
Wow.
yeah. And so we use that method, and it says it's a bad idea to take the average because there's so much heterogeneity.
In every one of the processes, was there one process
In
that,
this paper, everyone was significantly heterogeneous. It
so
was
every process in
never,
the PBAT, every process in the fiat, and every process in the Cyflex
yes,
was uh had
it was
high levels
shocking.
of
Yeah.
heterogeneity?
Yeah, at a level that you would not want, like the levels were, it's called I squared. And it was like, I'm looking at it now, they're all above, most of them are above 80, a lot of them are above 70 or 60. And basically, you wouldn't want to be above 50. Um, so 50% of the variance is, due to, I can't remember the exact interpretation. I have it written here somewhere, but it means that there's high levels of heterogeneity if it's 50 or above,
Mm,
and they're at 70 and 80. So this was much worse than I thought. You know, Steve Hayes really has been pushing in this direction, and his was, it seemed like he had the intuitions, but then I follow his intuitions, which are stunningly accurate, and it's always worse than he thought, and it was worse than I thought, and worse than we all thought. Like it was like, oh my goodness, this is like not even close. If we look at the PBAT,
mhm,
um, again, you see something like uh, it's worse because the people are even more variable with the PBAT in terms of like, so connecting to people, uh, doing things to connect to people who are close to me. Like that seems like an important thing, right?
mhm,
Doing things to benefit your connection. Um, Let me just see what that was. Well, in that instance, there were about, you know, it's more like 37% of the time, this process wasn't beneficial
mm,
and could have been a little bit negative. So that's 37%. So that's 1 in 3 people. Like if you're a person who's interpersonally oriented, you may, every time somebody comes to the door, may think the primary thing we need to focus on here is helping them improve their relationships. But for maybe a third, that right there in that moment in time for their life right now, that isn't the key thing,
Hmm.
right? And so the important thing to note is if that's not driving well-being for that person, what is? Because usually if it's not that, it's something else. And so you start to see where personalization comes in. Wow, for one third of the people, maybe this isn't the most pressing issue.
Hmm.
Maybe it's something else. So maybe I should be focusing on something else as a practitioner. So
So with taking averages across time, it's still up to the clinician to like recognize specific in the moment
yeah,
instances where, for example, acceptance might be helpful, or acceptance is maybe not, like now's not the right enough time, or maybe a different process would be better to use. Because from my
yeah, to
understanding,
focus on. Yeah,
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 because from my understanding, these are still looking at averages. They're averages across time, right? So, for example, if you have an outlier, or this actually wouldn't even be calling an outlier, it'd just be like a very, maybe what we would normally consider an outlier because we're so used to normative statistics. And for
yeah.
example, people who strengthen their connection to people, for 2% of them, I think it had like a negative effect with a negative, either positive this is negative affect, so it actually
It's
led to
negative. Yeah,
negative affect, right, for 2% of people, right? That's an average across time. So maybe there are instances when connecting to people increase their affect and instances where
yeah.
it decreased, but for 2% of people, it was, there were so many
General.
instances where connecting to deeply connecting to people led to negative affect, and to such a high degree that they're in that 2%.
Yeah, and it's not even like that's a bad thing. It's just like, wouldn't you want to know why that is? I mean, definitely connecting with people is super important to well-being generally,
Mhm.
but it's actually interesting to ask why it is when this person does that more in their daily life, they're actually more miserable.
Mm.
That's really important to know as a practitioner versus somebody who, when they say they do it, that's really driving their well-being. That makes it much easier for you. You're like, okay, what are you doing when you connect? That's the question you'd ask, and let's see how we can do more of that versus if connection isn't the relevant process, maybe it's for some people, it was like not having a meaningful challenge was the big driver, not connecting. So
Mm.
they maybe those people, they have good relationships, they're pretty happy, but they're just in a job they hate. It's not challenging them. They feel like they're wasting their life. Maybe for that person, you need to focus on something different. It's not really it's more about like, okay, how did you end up here in this job? And what can we do
Mm.
to help you? Another person might be like they just feel like they can't stop hurting their health. They're doing something to
Mm.
hurt their health. And that could be the big factor. That could be driving everything. Like they're
Oh, so
addicted.
it could be that there's a different process that has to do with their negative affect, but just even if they connect with people, it's not strong enough to lift that affect up because there's another process that's just so important.
Exactly. Well,
So
right now in your life, right now, Ben, let's say you're staying up till 4 in the morning, playing Dungeons and Dragons.
sure,
Um, okay, your sleep is really bad, and you're eating like really bad food as a result. Like,
sure,
so you're tired all the time, your energy levels are going up and down. And the days when you do that, when you do things to hurt your health, you're drinking too much, say,
sure.
you really are quite miserable. Well, that effect may swamp everything else. It's not that
Yeah,
connecting people is unimportant, but right now, Ben, the first thing we need to do in therapy is probably talk about you getting to sleep at a normal time.
yeah.
Like I know that seems trivial, but like
If it's having, yeah,
a
it might.
personalized approach would say, like for Ben, now once we got you sleeping, once we got you eating well, exercising, not drinking so much, maybe then the connecting process suddenly becomes more important. So
Mm.
it's dynamic. That's process-based therapy. It's not the same.
Yeah,
So suddenly that could become more important and change over time. So
yeah. So
that's
and
really the revolution. That's like
mhm,
crazy because you can't, it means you can't use the standardized intervention.
yeah, yeah. And one thing I'm trying to think back to is how this paper might be relevant for clinicians trying to practice PBT. And one thing that's kind of standing out for me, and maybe you have more to add to this, but one thing that's standing out for me is it kind of justifies a lot of the importance of, for example, maybe network diagramming, or just trying to look at more individually what is the relationships between these different processes that we see in this
Yep,
individual client person.
exactly.
Um, because
Thinking and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, like you have everybody's forced to do the DSM diagnosis, but like you could have three people who are depressed, but the process is involved in somebody who's grieving versus somebody who's going through a divorce versus somebody who's just very physically inactive and hurting their health. All of them might be depressed, but the processes are so completely different. And even a simple network diagram forces you to think, okay, what is the outcome? Okay, let's say it's sadness. And what are the processes? Hurting your health, connecting with others, um, allowing feelings, which are the
Mm.
most relevant processes for this person. So it's just a way of really focusing you on the specific person and what's going on for them and how it's affecting them.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions that I can ask, but I just wanted to make sure that you felt like if there's anything else that you wanted to just kind of talk about regarding the paper
Well, I
to,
just wanted to talk about one more thing, which
yeah,
I thought
go
was
for
really cool, which is Corey's data shows that like the least, I think, ergodic was the social stuff.
it. Okay.
So it was like all over the place. Like, for example, being assertive has no mean pooled effect on loneliness. So, you know how we have assertiveness training and teach people to kind of state their needs, blah, blah, blah. And that is important, but it depends on how they do it and the context and everything. So, but when you look at the variability, for some people, being assertive was was helping them to be less lonely. For other people, it was making them much more lonely.
Mm.
So and it was the same thing for other interpersonal things like giving feedback to people. For some people in their life, this was increasing loneliness. For some people, it was hurting their loneliness. It was helping reduce loneliness. Asserting your needs was not always beneficial. Expressing feelings. So the
Mm.
social behaviors are I think, are extremely contextually bound and need to be understood and can't be understood as I need to teach people to express their feelings. That's just a good thing to teach everybody, independent of the context they're in.
Mm. So
And
one question
practitioners probably know that, but yeah. So go
One
ahead.
question that's
Sorry.
actually important, I think, that I missed is is this a randomized control trial, or is this just we studied people across time who weren't clinical populations or just weren't going through anything specific?
Yes. So some of them, this is all like kind of baseline data before the trial. Let's say before the randomized trial starts. In
Ah,
Andrew's case, he did do a randomized trial. And we're really interested to see this question of how processes change after the trial versus before.
sure.
But you could think of this as almost like, okay, you're waiting to see if a therapist or a friend or something. And during
Okay.
that 3 week period, we're saying right now in your life, this is really what's big for you.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely. This is
come
what
and
I
talk to
tried to do for myself before. I just didn't have this. Like, I would like try and
Yeah,
get a baseline for it, and then I'd burn out before I do like
absolutely.
a PBAT in the morning, and I did that for like a month. I did a PBAT in the morning and a PBAT in the no, I did it in the evening, like at noon, and then one at night.
Yeah.
And I had like an
Yep.
extra like sleep and like those measures and stuff like that. Just never got through to the end. But
We're hoping to make that easier for you. I absolutely agree with you. We need to support you with kind of apps and things like that just to make it easy. I mean, it is painful enough to record that, but I think you should just be able to kind of push a button and then get a report after you've
well,
done all that work instead of having
some
to
of
do
the
it
things that you
yourself.
talked about in the paper were insane regarding like ways that we can collect data. I mean, wearables already collect data on sleep and physical activity and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But also you were talking about ways that we can collect data regarding uh like recording audio and
Yeah.
coding audio and stuff like that. That's
I think so. I think it'd be interesting to have just an audio journal. Like you could really say a lot like how your day is going. We're working on that too, like how to use AI to translate audio to themes and ideas about what, again, trying to identify the unique processes that you're having. I think audio would be really cool because it allows you to really express your specific, you know, what you're struggling with at that time in your own way.
mm,
So it's
that's
about more personalization. Yeah.
that's really interesting. So um awesome. And so I think for the people who are listening to this, if they're in my situation, who are wanting to listen to this just to get a foot in the door, the tables here that's what I found so fascinating. I was, turning through this paper, being like, oh my God, okay, so I'm gonna talk to the guy who like was the primary author on this thing later. So I gotta like read through this, and some of the introduction and the statistical stuff was a bit difficult. But once I started getting to the tables and I understood what I was looking at, I was like, wow, I really sat with those pages. So starting, I think at table 3, there's some really interesting stuff for people to
Yeah.
take a
Well, I
look at.
think actually, if you the figures actually tell the story. So
Hmm.
figure 2, 3, and 4, they're kind of profiles of people. And what's cool about that is that you can look at those profiles and try and think about, okay, it shows what processes are important versus unimportant, right? And you can look at those profiles and say, okay, how would I intervene differently for these different people? So we've got 4 people for each of the types of process measure.
Mhm.
You can see, like, so if they want to look at figure 2, 3, and 4, that would probably tell the biggest story. So for one
Mm,
person, it's clear that the self pole, having a stable sense of self for person one is deeply important, but not for necessarily person two.
mm,
So, for them, it's the committed action that is important.
mm.
So, that's the question of how would you, you know, so I think start with those figures, figure 2, 3, and 4, and they really
Awesome.
kind of highlight the importance.
All right. So, really quick, we're approaching the time that we have scheduled. Do you have the 30 extra minutes or do you have to head off here?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah,
Um,
3 minutes will be fine. Absolutely.
3 or 30?
Oh, another 30.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
because I'm curious on what time that you have to dip.
Yeah, yeah. It's somebody going to listen to us for that long, Ben? Is it? I mean, I'm happy to talk that long, but I'd be shocked if I guess
I
they could
don't know.
listen to us.
Again, I've never done this before. You're calling this a podcast, which is very, very gracious because I think I'm gonna do my minimal editing and just I'm blasting this out. Hopefully, it's gonna be a helpful resource for somebody. So,
Yeah,
um,
I mean, I'm happy to keep talking.
okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, let's keep.
You mentioned or you guys mentioned um self-determination theory near the end of the paper. And
Yeah,
as just kind of one of as an interesting implication or example of how these findings could implicate to other areas of research. And I was curious if you could explain that a little bit more. Help me
yep,
understand what were you guys trying to talk about there, and how can these findings implicate to this big theory?
yeah. So, I mean, I think um, one of the things that PBT allows us to do is to um, talk to other approaches. And self-determination theory is one that I think a lot of ACT people would particularly like because it focuses on what motivates people to do things and what helps them to sustain motivation to keep doing things. And so it's a
Mm,
theory of motivation that I think connects very nicely to values.
mm,
Um, so it's like, so in self-determination theory, there's 3 kinds of motives. There is motivation for autonomy, like to basically have
autonomy,
choices.
competence, and relatedness, right?
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly. So autonomy is the one where you're like, you want to feel like you have a choice
yeah,
and you'll do
volition.
things. You'll see kids will deliberately do things that are destructive to them just to prove that they had a choice,
Yeah.
like, but just having the choice and the freedom to choose valued action, I think is important. Then competence is about the effectiveness of how effective are you in life? Like, do you feel like you can do things and be effective and be able to have skill, I guess would be the way I would think of that. So it's really like being a challenge and challenges
Sense
and
of
having
mastery.
challenges. Yeah, mastery. And then connection's the obvious one. And so they argue that these 3 basic needs are quite central to what drives us. And there's a lot of research to support it. And I feel like it links naturally in with values because we really encourage people to own their values personally, not to do it just from compliance. So
Mhm.
that's autonomy. We encourage people to take on challenges, to do things that are hard, leave their comfort zone. It's kind of confidence, I think, related.
Mhm.
And of course, ACT is very big on connection
Yeah.
and promote and connecting with people. So the self-determination theory is saying those are basic needs, like so fundamental that if you don't have those needs met, you will be miserable. And
Mm,
so I feel like process-based therapy can now, we don't have to just say the word values, we can say the word motivation, and we can label that under the heading of motivation in general, that they both are similar kinds of things, and we don't have to treat them as fundamentally different. We don't have to feel threatened by each other's words and approaches. We
mm.
can bring them all together.
Interesting. Okay. So, um, that's kind of a bit of an introduction to what self-determination theory is. I remember I think it was like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I had no idea what I was reading, but read a paper that said intrinsic motivation on it, and someone explained it to me. So I think I was like, for some reason, I thought I knew what
Yeah.
I was reading, but I just remember like running around my house trying to show my parents. I was like, this is it. This is what I mean. This is so
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah. So
It's a big one, yeah.
yeah, I
So
think this
that
is
that's right.
awesome.
So things differ on how much it's autonomous. So kind of you choose it versus how much you just feel pressure to do it or guilty or you're just doing it because you have to. And so they you can put things on a continuum. And the more closer to the autonomy side, the better it is for your health and well-being. And the more likely you are to keep doing it.
So, but in the paper, what they talk about is um, I think what you guys talk about is how some of these ideas in self-determination theory were nomothetically validated. So they're validated using data sets that were based on group averages. And it wasn't to suggest that these findings weren't to suggest that, for example, instances of actually low autonomy was actually associated with higher well-being for some people, or that for some people,
Yeah.
a low amount of competence was associated with a higher amount of well-being. It doesn't invalidate the theory,
No,
but you
that was
guys
an
did want to
interesting
make,
case. Yeah.
yeah. What was the kind of trying to what was the point or suggestion that you're trying to make there?
Well, this is going to be controversial because it doesn't, but I don't think it is actually when you unpack it. Self-determination theory says that these are universal,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably true in some sense that they are universal. Like the stuff we've identified, like acceptance, allowing feelings, are probably generally good in a universal sense. But it doesn't mean that at this present moment, it's probably more like we're going to see instances, I think, where autonomy isn't really driving the person's well-being. Fluctuations in that isn't driving their well-being. Just because in that moment, maybe it's something else that's more important, maybe competence or connection. So
Mm-hmm.
it could be, it could be a universal process in general. You take away their autonomy, they'll definitely be less happy. But the thing to focus on at any particular moment may differ for a person. Now, this was speculative, but I picked self-determination theory because it was such a universalistic theory to say, look,
Mm-hmm.
there can still be, there's still a small set of things that make people happy. Like we know people need to be challenged. We know people need to connect. We know people, need to allow feelings and be able to be in the present moment, and they need to do things to help their health. But any given moment for a particular person in their life, what's most prominent may differ, right? And as a therapist, you want to kind of focus on what's most relevant, what to do the first things first.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the argument we're making. I thought self-determination theory was a good place to do it because they're a universalistic theory.
Awesome. This leaves me with two more questions, and then we can cut it off there and see if this was helpful for some people. Hopefully, it was. I
Sure.
found this really fucking fascinating. So, oh, I should watch my language. I'm sorry.
That's
Okay.
all right.
So,
Sure, nobody will care.
okay. So, but this is the interesting question, right? Is you talk about how, maybe it's not that this isn't actually universal for people, but that certain processes are more prominent in determining well-being for some people, right?
At a
That
time, at a
at
particular
a
time, in
certain
in a
particular,
context.
yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah.
And that we might have certain results where an individual person across the time that we measured them didn't find a huge impact of having a sense of autonomy relating to their well-being, but that was just because in the time that we measured
Yeah.
them, that's just
That's
kind of
speculative, by the way. It may not be true. That we could find that it does, that it's not, that it is ergodic, that actually, I'm just guessing. I mean, I really want to do that study actually, but we
yeah.
don't know.
So we don't know yet. So this is an interesting frontier, I guess.
Actually, I want
But
to find out if there's data on that. Yeah. It's an
um,
interesting question.
but the question is then, and I think this is the question that I had, and I imagine many did when they first saw this paper that came out, which is, how can people figure this out for themselves? The more prominent processes that either for their clients or even for themselves, personally, is how can we
Yeah.
kind of identify these determinants?
I, I think that clinicians are doing it to some extent naturally through the interview and stuff, but I think we're trying to come up with um, apps and methods that make it easier, that make it more natural to do this. I mean, if you spend a lot of time trying to do a diagnosis from the DSM, you're probably less focused on processes and outcomes. So one of the shifts of PBT is to make you a little bit more focused on what are the key outcomes that's important to this client, what are the processes that are driving it. as opposed to, is this person clinically depressed? Is this person anxious?
Mm.
Um, so more, and then linking that in a network. So what we're trying to do is just make the actual assessment more like what they're going to need to know to do the intervention.
Can you say that
So
one more time?
a network theory. So
Mm.
network approach where you draw out the processes and outcomes. That that very way of thinking of things draws your attention to what processes are really driving things for that particular individual, right? Because the
Mm.
network will be different for different people.
Mm.
So that learning how to diagram networks is one way, but there's infinite number of ways. There is also we're working on an app that will allow you to kind of provide you with information about what processes are most important to the client. Just a simple,
Interesting.
these are the top three. These are the big ones for the client right now.
And
So and
how
here,
would the app determine that? Would the app be taking data?
yeah. So you do. It's called Mind Grapher, and it will measure data repeatedly. And then when after you get enough data points, you'll be able to go into a dashboard, and it will say these are the prominent things.
Is that out yet or no?
It's very close. I'm hoping we'll get it out in September, so it's coming very, very
Ah,
soon. I just didn't want to release it too early because we still have a few things to. It's very close. It's a nice little app. It's very nice
that's
indeed.
exciting. That is so
And
exciting.
you'll be able to say, okay, I'm interested in what's driving my well-being this week or this month, and then you take it, and then you can just upload it and play around and look at what's driving well-being for you. Yeah,
Awesome.
so it's pretty cool.
That's fantastic. Okay. And last question. Uh, this would be, I guess, a kind of big shift in how I'm asking this question. A lot less in terms of making this paper accessible, but this last question is more for the, what are the implications for PBT researchers? And also, um, kind of in the nitty gritty, what is the statistical, like, how do you explain the statistics of this? What is
Oh boy.
REMAX and what is going
Okay.
on here?
I mean, I'll start with the implication. First of all, if you want to look into the individual lives, and I would say do it because it will add value to all the normative research that's been done before, the group-based research. So previously, there's like decades of research on like things like self-compassion is correlated with the good stuff, right? Um,
Yeah.
but and if you feel like as a researcher, you're like, oh God, that's all been answered. There's nothing to be done. Well, there is lots to be done if once you start looking at the individual level, because that's virtually an unknown. So
Mm,
we just published a paper on self-compassion,
yep.
compassion, self and other compassion harmony,
Yep. I'm gonna interview.
led
How do
by
you say her name? Balgender? How do you say
Belginder Sadra. Yeah, yeah. So
Belgender?
yep,
Okay.
exactly. And
Awesome.
she just published a paper showing, for example, that whether self-compassion is beneficial to you or not depends on whether you feel it is, you experience it as being in conflict with other compassion. So if you experience it as not in harmony in your life, you don't really benefit so much from self-compassion. And so for those people who experience maybe even conflict, I think the kind of intervention you would approach would be different. You try to look at the conflict and how to resolve it. Now, if somebody's already in harmony, like the majority of people are in harmony, when they experience self-compassion, they also experience more compassion for others, which is awesome. That's awesome.
Mhm.
Then you basically want to just try to help them increase self-compassion might be something that's reasonable to do because there's no downside really. I mean, maybe there is. You still have to look at context, but you know what I mean? That so getting back to your question about what I would say for researchers, this field is wide open because
Mm,
what this paper shows is the violations are really big. So now we need to kind of get in and look at why that is and how we can use that information to customize therapy, personalized therapy. We don't know how to do that yet either. So
interesting.
there's a
Wow.
vast unknown. It points to a vast unknown. And that's exciting for researchers because there's so many questions to ask.
So for researchers, it's important to know that this paper, it doesn't answer the question of how to discover personalized determinants for well-being. It's saying that this is a question that's really important and that we need
Well,
to figure this out.
it does give you a method for determining what's important to different people.
Yeah.
So it does answer that question,
Okay.
but it doesn't. But now, how do we apply that? How does a clinician use that information? We still need to figure that out. That's
Mm,
super important. But the first step was do people differ in a way that's reliable enough that we could use it? I think that this paper says we think so because people are very different in what drives their well-being across all three measures. That was another thing to use, cut across many different measures to show that this is a big issue, not just specific to one thing, but to most process-based measures.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
And I know this is going back really uh going back a lot, but you had mentioned that the population or the sample, it's not population, the sample of people that was being looked at, they were kind of like a base, there's like baseline measurements. Were these people who are struggling with certain mental health issues, or is this like a
In
like
Andrew's study, they were, but in Brandon and Corey's study, they were community samples, I
okay,
believe. Yeah.
awesome, awesome.
Yep.
And then so last question is they talked about Max for a lot
Yeah.
of the introduction. And I was just trying to understand, like, what are the statistics that you guys are doing here? If you can.
Well, it's actually common in economics to use this method. It maybe not at the individual level, but it's like you have two time series. You have your level of well-being, which is fluctuating day to day, and you have, let's say, a process like hurting your health day to day, and or moment to moment, or whatever you're doing. And so when you do time series, there's all kinds of special statistical things at time series. Like
Mhm,
things are dependent on each other, right? Like the stock
mhm,
market goes up, 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 up. So previous values, new values depend on the previous value. So you just need to use special statistics for time series, and that's Aramax.
mhm,
If you use normal statistics, it violates a whole bunch of assumptions, like the data points are independent. Like that's one of the assumptions of normal, like regression, but they're not independent. If you're in a bad mood in the morning, you tend to be in a bad, a lot of people tend to be a bad mood in the afternoon too. So they're dependent on, your values are dependent on each other
mhm,
in the series of time. And time series change, so people change. And a lot of the ordinary, I'm not going to say ordinary regression and things like that, assume that there's no change. So it's things like that. It's just a method of dealing with time.
mhm. How can
Um,
people get an introduction if they just maybe Google time series statistics, or um,
yeah,
if people
that
want to
paper
use.
walks through it. But if you're really interested in that geeky side, yeah, I think it's time series analysis is the key thing. But what we hope to do is in this app, we will do that time series analysis for you. So you don't have to know actually how to implement it, right? You will
Sure.
see Aramax, you'll see time series derived coefficients showing you what processes are important. But if
Awesome.
you're into the geeky side of things, the paper does explain it. And yeah, there's stuff on Arama, and it will talk about that. That's used a lot in economics if you're trying to predict the stock market or inflation or things like that. Economists love it. Just psychologists haven't used it very much.
Interesting. So people can even look up ARMA and
Yeah.
uh is if yeah, is there a specific paper that you might recommend or something like that, or just a good
God,
paper is good?
I don't think so. I kind of learned from lots of different books and stuff, and just trying to. They're not always easily understood. I do think the explanation in the paper that I put forward, because I know that a lot of people aren't familiar with it, isn't bad. I
Okay.
hope it's clear. It's only a few paragraphs, so I actually do walk through it very carefully in the paper. I
Okay.
hope they don't cut it in the edits if it gets accepted. But
Awesome.
yeah, but then maybe the understand the paper and it'll discuss all
Yeah.
the way that it's done, and then
I think I either missed that part, that part just didn't click well.
yeah, let's see,
I'll
it's
look back at it.
there. Yeah, I just spent a lot of time on it because psychologists are often not as familiar.
Yeah.
So it's a section called, let me see if I can find it, the Aramex analytic procedure. And
Okay.
it's five, six pairs, seven. Wow, I really did put a lot in there. Seven, 8 paragraphs. Okay, so 8 paragraphs. So the main thing to put the I in front of it is just that instead of taking an average time series, we'd look at each individual's.
Hmm.
So each individual has a time series of their affect, each individual has a time series of their process that we're interested in, which might be assertiveness. So we
Yeah.
see assertiveness. When they're assertive, their affect is going up. They're really happy. When they're not assertive, it's going down. That's we're kind of tracking that.
Interesting. This is fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you so
Of
much.
course.
I think this is all the questions that I had. So
All right. Excellent. So we'll
awesome.
see. I hope it's interesting to people.
I hope so too. All right, cool. I'm gonna end the recording. Thank you so much. All right,
All right.
doodles.